Good morning. Thank you for being here. My name is Venkat Iyer. On behalf of my workshop team and our faculty advisor, Louise Rosen, I'd like to present the final briefing on the S.585, which is the American Natural Gas Security and Consumer Protection Act. So in outline of today's presentation, I'm going to tell a quick story on the background and the current problem in natural gas in the United States. I'm going to talk about the purpose of the legislation then, and then go right into our program design, the design specifically in terms of the budget, the outcomes, and the conclusion. So to start with, this graph on my left is showing the United States natural gas exports, and production has been rising rapidly in the last decade, with the US becoming a net exporter by 2020. Two key takeaways from this graph. One is that exports are going to continue to rise. Domestic prices right now are about $2.50 per 1,000 cubic feet. And internationally, when you average out Europe and Asia, they're about $8. So you can see there's a really nice incentive for exporters to produce more and send this product overseas that can double their profit. Secondly, on this graph, 2005 onwards, there's been a sharp spike in production. And this is due to lots of reasons, but mainly because of a technology known as hydraulic fracturing in combination with directional drilling. So before I get into this diagram of hydraulic fracturing, I'd like to point out one thing, is that the Energy Policy Act of 2005 had something colloquially known as the Halliburton loophole. So what this does is that the fracking industry is exempt from the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, and the Safe Drinking Water Act. And this poses several negative environmental externalities. To begin with, the process involves vertical drilling, right here, and the horizontal component is what's new. So when you combine the fracturing and the horizontal component, this is what's been happening since the early 2000s, known as the fracking revolution. So when you flush these fracking fluids down this vertical pipe, and these fracking fluids contain several chemicals, some of which are carcinogens such as benzene and toluene, you can have issues such as water contamination and chemical migration. So if there are cracks in the wells or leaks in the pipes down below, then these chemicals can potentially go into the groundwater and migrate. So that's one issue. Another issue is wastewater spills. So what happens is that the water comes right back up, and every single year the fracking industry uses about 280 billion gallons of wastewater. So, and this wastewater contains the same chemicals being flushed down, so this is an issue as well. The picture on the top right shows a fracking pit next to a production site, and this wastewater contains all those chemicals, and if there are leaks in this fracking pit as well, then there are going to be chemicals in the environment. So this is an issue. And that brings us to the purpose of our legislation today. So our bill is sponsored by Senator Ed Markey of Massachusetts, and the purpose is to prioritize the public interest in the natural gas extraction process, most notably when it comes to the environment. And there are two key requirements. One is the environmental impact statement. So this is a document required by the National Environment Policy Act, which requires specific industries which have significant damage to the environment to produce a document to show what those impacts exactly are and the exact remediation and mitigation steps they're doing to prevent this damage. Next, the Secretary of Energy has got discretion to grant the export permits. So what this does is that the DOE Secretary will have discretion to assess the public interest and also gauge the EISs coming in to grant these export permits to the natural gas producers. So our program design looks like this. The companies will have to submit the EIS to the government to obtain their export permit. And the main component of our program design is something called the Mitigation Action Plan, which is also known as MAP MAPs. So what these are is that they are the specific remediation and mitigation steps for each production site locally on what steps they're taking to mitigate the environmental impact. And within these maps, we have three components. The first one is 100% chemical disclosure by companies. I mentioned earlier in this presentation that the fracking fluid contains lots of chemicals, carcinogens and non-carcinogens, and at the moment, it's not 100% required for these companies to disclose these chemicals because it can potentially be a trade secret underneath business laws. So we want the government to know these exact chemicals and the exact substantive amounts in each site so we can continue with the next step in our process, which is chemical monitoring. So what happens here is that the companies will be doing baseline and periodic testing in their site before they frack and continuously year after year, and the government is going to come in and do random audits to make sure that the information they're giving us is accurate and compliant within our regulations. And finally, from a wastewater management point of view, We want to make sure that we track the produced water, which is industry jargon for wastewater. So we want to minimize the water loss, and to do that, we want to set a pre-treatment standard. Currently, federal regulations are hazy in this matter, so there's no clear uniform standard that these industries have to conform to. And it's just a more general industry standard that these industries are doing amongst themselves. So if we establish a federal standard, we can not only track this much easier, but we know the exact chemicals being removed every single time. And that's going to be a huge help in tracking this produced water to minimize the loss. From an organizational perspective, here's how it's going to work. So on the top left, you can see the Export Office and the DOE working in conjunction with NEPA compliance, which again stands for the National Environmental Policy Act. They oversee all the EISs coming in from the industries that require it. And the EPA Regional Office will also be involved. They'll be doing the checks and the samples and the chemicals along the sites to make sure that the sites are compliant with our regulations. We'll be creating a new office, and that's a natural gas MAPS team. So what this team does is that it provides advice on these natural gas sites on their exact mitigation and remediation strategies associated with each problem in each site. And those will be the three components of our program, which is chemical disclosure, chemical monitoring, and wastewater. So here's how it's going to look from a natural gas company's perspective. You're going to be giving your export permit application to the DOE Export Office. You're going to be submitting your draft EIS with the maps included to the Office of NEPA Compliance. And finally, that EIS will be going to the EPA regional offices for a public comment period. And once that's taken care of, you'll get your final EIS, and that's going to be given to the DOE Secretary for approval for the export permit. From a budget perspective, it's going to cost $850,000 in 2016. This is mainly divided up into the three components of our MAPS unit. It's going to be largely due to personnel cost, what's 74% of it. The remainder, 26%, will be non-personnel, such as lodging and transportation. And this is detailed more in our final report. So we have three different components, and here are our program outcomes. From a chemical disclosure perspective, we want no unknown chemicals. So I'm talking from the perspective of the government. We want to know the exact chemicals in each site, and we don't want any unknown chemicals. Once we know these chemicals, we can do our monitoring step. And we can control the chemical migration by doing our samples in each site with the EPA audits, making sure that everything is consistent, and knowing the exact chemical in each site will be a huge part in controlling for potential problems. And for wastewater management, we want to minimize the wastewater loss. Currently, as I said before, 280 billion gallons are produced every single year. And minimizing the wastewater loss in terms of leaks is critical. And once we establish a federal standard, we can know exactly how much wastewater is pre-treated and the exact chemicals being removed every single time, allowing us to track this more effectively. So in conclusion, I mentioned in the beginning of this presentation that natural gas exports are rising rapidly, and prioritizing the public interest in this process when it comes to the environmental impact statement is critical. And our program defines the effective mitigation action plans for inclusion, and this increases the transparency. As Professor Cohen always mentions, if you can't measure it, you cannot monitor it, correct? So in this particular case, we have a situation where the natural gas industry is deregulated in some fashion by the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, and the Safe Drinking Water Act. And we need a lot more information when it concerns the chemicals in these areas to make sure we can minimize the uncertainties in the fracturing process. Thank you. And I'm very happy to take any questions.
Hey, Venkat, thanks. That was a wonderful presentation. I got a quick question on the environmental impact statements. You seem to be focusing on their use for the natural gas for export. Are the same impact statements required for fracking for natural gas used domestically?
Yeah. So basically, the environmental impact statement is a federal regulation, and companies do have to conform to that to some extent. And the issue we were focusing on today was the uncertainties in the process. So it's not necessary now that they have to disclose all their chemicals and do the monitoring, et cetera, et cetera. So to answer your question, I would say yes, they need to do that to some extent. But the environmental impact statement is a process that is not, for example, 80% of the sites in the United States, fracking sites, are from small companies. So these large corporations have to do the EIS, but not necessarily on a more local scale. So we want more EISs on a local scale, and we want to implement our three components to make sure that we can know all the chemical information.
Thank you, Venkat, for such a great presentation. I had just a question. It might be slightly outside the scope of your program's design. Do you see this process of essentially implementing NEPA over this industry as a step towards substantive controls and caps on this procedure?
Sure. Well, I would argue that NEPA is essential in overseeing this industry. The critical issue that this industry faces, of course, is colloquially known as the Halliburton loophole, which was established in 2005. And there's actually another act which is very, very similar to our action plan. It's known as currently in Congress right now under vote, and it's called the Fracking Responsibility and Awareness of Chemicals Act, which essentially seeks to repeal the Halliburton loophole. So what this action plan is doing is, in some extent, similar to that particular bill, but to answer your question, I would say the NEPA not only is integral, but I think it's a vital component to oversee this industry, and I think it's very necessary.
Thank you, Venkat. My question actually builds very well off the last one. I was just curious about the political context surrounding this and the legal context. It sounds like this is not actually a bill, but an action plan, and there is an accompanying bill in Congress. Legally, it sounds like they want to repeal the Halliburton loophole, but I don't know how is that done exactly, and what's the congressional landscape in terms of political support and opposition?
Sure, that's a very loaded question. So I suppose my answer to that one will be my own opinion and not necessarily of my workshop team. So there are a lot of, for example, in Texas. Senator Ted Cruz, a current presidential candidate, wants to actually relax the regulations in natural gas. He sees the current sanctions as too robust. So in terms of support, you see support in Democrats and Republicans both alike, support and of course anti. This is not an issue where it's one versus the other. For example, the lead lobbyist agency for natural gas, the leader of that used to be a Democrat under the Clinton administration. So you can see from a political angle, a lot of people are divided on this. In terms of the Halliburton loophole, and you were talking about the current act which wants to repeal it, that's a separate story. So in that sense, it is possible to repeal the Halliburton loophole underneath the act right now in Congress, which is a separate act. Essentially, it wants to make sure that this industry is regulated under the Safe Drinking Water Act. And that's pretty much all it says. It's a two-line bill for the most part, and it was passed in 2009 and was repealed, and then now it's back in Congress by the senator from Pennsylvania. So it's a back and forth issue, and it needs to be done reasonably quickly because at the moment, honestly, we have no idea of these chemicals. There are 1,000 different chemicals in the fracking fluid, out of which one of my team members, Jay, was talking to a lawyer in this business, and we only know about 20 of these chemicals and what they do. So we have about 980 chemicals in these sites that we have no idea whatsoever what they're doing, and fixing this problem is going to be critical if we want to increase these exports.
So very nice presentation. Your program involves audits, and audits can be intensive of time, labor, and dollars, but your program budget is rather modest. So I wonder whether or not those auditors are how you're going to pay for all that auditing.
Sure. So our audits are going to be taking place in the EPA regional offices, and all we're really going to be doing is taking site samples and sending them to a lab and getting the information. The program would cost a lot more if you would actually implement the information coming in, but really the program is designed to gather the information data, and obviously there would be we would allocate more of a budget if we want to actually do something about it later on. But at the moment we want to gather information, which is why I believe we hire about 12 technical specialists in our budget across these EPA regional offices, and they'll be doing the testing. So at the moment we don't feel that it's going to require more money, but later on within our 1 or 2 year time frame, that could possibly provide more money as well. Thanks.